I'm not sure how much I have to add to what Pablo just said. I can barely remember a talk in recent months where I can say I have agreed with everything that was said. And I think I will say that here. Let me just sort of put a few things in the Indian context and also make some general comments about where the larger world is going, or where the world as a whole is going, because India is so much a part of the world now that we can't talk about India as a separate entity at all. I think the most important thing is what Pablo said right at the end, which is that it's a systemic crisis. This is not an environmental problem like plastics or DDT or something. Climate change is the context in which all other problems are now transpiring, including other environmental problems. So it's not just another environmental crisis story, it's the very context has changed. There is a shift in the very paradigm of human existence and life, which has come to light in the last quarter century. So that's, I think, something we need to constantly remember, which means that this hasty sort of habit we have, or this habit of haste that we have today, which is that we start looking for solutions and we subject ourselves or get subjected to solutionism, is a very dangerous habit, because it prevents us from actually grasping the depth and complexity of the crisis that climate is now posing for humanity and other species. So if there is to be a solution, we have to think in terms of many, many millions of solutions. In order to get to those millions of solutions, we have to have an approach which has to be correct. And by correct, one means something very scientific here, which is it has to be in some ways in sync with the natural order of things. And one has to claim that there is a natural order of things, which the modern economy for the last quarter millennium, at least, has violated, and which is why we are in the morass that we are in. IBM wants to build a smarter planet. I once sat down with students to try to deconstruct that sentence, and we came up with at least 40 lies that have been told in that one innocent statement. And we are told that lie every evening. Now, this is where the real problem lies. The problem which Pablo was pointing to is actually a crisis of vision. We have been taught, systematically taught, to misperceive reality. Our cognition is severely wounded today. So the world that we see and we believe ourselves to be living in is actually not the real world. We may think of it as real because others around us are also thinking of it as real, but there is a deeper real world which we have been denied access to. And the IBM slogan is actually attracting us in exactly the opposite direction to that world. One definition of progress which I find very useful and functional for our times, or for any time in the last 200 years, is to think of progress as distance from nature. The farther you can get from nature, the more progress you make. And the way I used to explain this to students when I was teaching environmental economics was, it's as though models don't shit, to put it very crudely. What I'm trying to say is that right now, wherever we are sitting, wherever we are living, it's nature. You can't get away from it. To have a definition of life and progress in life as distance from that which you cannot get away from is the most absurd thing. And since ancient times, since the times of at least the Greek philosophers, it's been understood that at a certain dimension of existence, movement or change actually does not happen. There are mathematical theorems which prove that movement is actually impossible. So whatever Darwin and others have thought of as evolution, as man coming from the apes and so on, is happening in a very superficial dimension actually. There is something deeper at which at that level nothing ever stirs. And this was, I think, the contribution of the world religions to actually alert humanity to that inside us, or that which works through us, which is eternal. Until we regain our connection, our relationship to that eternity, I think we will be in crisis. So the only point on which I might slightly disagree, not disagree, but I think I'd like to amplify on what Pablo said, is that it's not just a crisis of the capitalist system. It's the crisis of a whole way of life and the vision that corresponds, or the absence of vision that corresponds to that way of life, that the whole world has now been led into. America's biggest export today is not any product, but itself. There are more Americans in India now than in the United States. Psychologically speaking, culturally speaking, who they want to become, what they want to live, how they treat their parents, how they treat their children. We have many more Americans here now than in America. So America is now a state of mind, a state of being, a way of life, and that dream has been made, rendered all too accessible, all too tangible through the technologies at human disposal. And that's what IBM means by spreading the contagion of the smarter planet. Now, I want to make one comment about inequality, which I think is very important to understand. Inequality has been understood by social scientists typically as a matter of social injustice, that some have a lot, others don't have much, etc. Today, I don't think we can afford such a narrow perspective. It's much more than that. And I'll just say this here, that inequality has very direct environmental consequences. In today's context, with the extremes that the world allows and accepts, you have the rich increasingly being able to retreat into well-protected, well-insulated green bubbles. And in every metropolitan area of the earth, you find the rich doing that. They will create a green bubble in the metro, and they will have a green bubble in the countryside, and they'll have another green bubble in some desert island, etc. And they all have made their survival plans, their survival strategies, and have convinced themselves and each other that even when the jets can't fly, we will have those islands, we'll have those places, and so on. Now, such people are the most powerful decision makers in the world. They do not have to bear any of the consequences in the short or even in the somewhat long term of their actions or the policies that hold their lives, I dare say our lives, in place. Okay? So you don't have any incentive to change from that end of the social spectrum. And now think of the other extreme. Those who've been dispossessed of land, of water, of forests, of minerals, every wherewithal of existence to which they had access till just a generation or two ago is now not accessible to them. They're going to scrounge around for any last piece of nature they can. So you make them more desperate. The rich are running from other things, so everybody is running. You've created a world in which nobody is going to be content in any way where they are. Now, this is the sort of psychological and existential crisis in which the so-called system or the so-called civilization of today, modern civilization, has placed us, which is that there is instability built into its bedrock. So that's why they say the more things change, the more they remain the same. So now you have a situation where the way of life is actually revealing its deepest shades, its truest colors, and that is, in one word of 3 letters, war. Yeah? So if you have a system which is coming from war, and you design a whole economy which is built on the assumptions of warfare, okay, and then you have a whole society which now operates according to the rules of the economy, which is operating according to the rules of war, what do you get? You get a society which is constantly going to be fighting with itself. So the whole project has been this. And for 500 years and more, this has been the project, right? And that is now coming to an end. That is what my instinct tells me. And we have to prepare, therefore, at multiple dimensions. And we have to work in multiple ways. And we have to break all the rules of linear logic. And we have to look at things holistically, look at things systemically, look at things in some larger cosmology, if we want to arrive at a place which has some peace and stability and happiness about it. So, I mean, to the mainstream establishment anywhere in the world, it's worth saying to them, we don't live in a scientific society anymore, because we don't even know what the facts are, and where we do know what the facts are, we have no ways to respond to these facts. We do not have the institutions to respond to these facts. We do not have the human psychologies and approaches to respond to these facts. So therefore, we can say we live in a technological society, but we do not live in a scientific society. And the difference is huge. It's massive. Now, the problem in India, well, I want to say one more thing before I get to India. So, as long as we have competitive industrialism, we will continue to face what we face in much worse form. So it's not just capitalism, it's about any society which is caught in circumstances or chooses to be in circumstances where it wishes to compete with another society for economic and political power. This is not about growth in order to end poverty or improve conditions of less privilege, none of that. It's really about victory. It's really about being number one, staying number one, or getting to number one. And you invite the whole world into that race. That's what it's about. So it's about competitive industrialism. Now, there's a paradox in economics which goes by Jevons paradox, which is something like this. In Britain, in the 19th century, there was a major crisis in the supply of coal. Coal was becoming very expensive because of the high demand with the Industrial Revolution. So what they started doing was they started building more efficient engines. And they started getting coal from abroad, imports. And they hoped that both these things would reduce the demand for coal and reduce prices of coal. Instead, what happened was the exact opposite. As engines became more efficient, the goalposts moved. Okay? If you're in a competitive system, that's what will happen. So once the goalposts moved, everybody is demanding more coal suddenly from the production side. Right? Now, you can take this example as paradigmatic of other stories. I mean, for instance, cars becoming fuel efficient. Does that mean overall auto source pollution is going to go down? No. The world has seen the exact opposite. This city sees the exact opposite. Pollution levels here are much worse than they were 20 years ago. And why? Because while the per unit pollution caused by an automobile has gone down, the number of automobiles has way outstripped that, the effect of that. Or you look at the supply of road space in this city. When I first came to Delhi in 1978, there were no traffic jams. There were just 2 or 3 flyovers, I think, in the city. Now you have, I think, 150 or 200. People used to say, have more flyovers in order to tackle the traffic problems of that time. And now you have more flyovers and many more traffic problems. So demand is always going to be ahead of supply in these situations. So there's a Jevons paradox of production and there's a Jevons paradox of consumption. And this is not possible to escape with the rules of the game being set up the way they are. So what do we have then? We have a situation where no supply-based approach, whether it's emissions control or some other, is going to be adequate by itself. You need a far more radical diagnosis and a far more radical set of cures to the whole issue. Now I want to move to India and talk a little bit, just very briefly, about where our responsibilities lie and what we might think of doing. My co-author and I did some back-of-the-envelope calculations of the relative footprints of the different income groups in the society. And we came up with a set of numbers which we report in our book based on very conservative, actually, World Bank data. But one number which will interest you, I think, is that those of us who use a car and a laptop, our footprint is on average about 15 to 20 times that of somebody born in the slum across the road from where I live in Vasant Kunjan in South Delhi. So that's the extent of difference. So, when people give population-based arguments, they should remember that a child born to a family like mine would be 15 or 20 times ecologically more costly than a child born to the man who comes to clean my house, for instance. Now, this has the same sort of consequences, environmental consequences that inequality has, which we were just talking about. When it comes to looking at climate change from an Indian perspective, the Bihar Chief Minister, Nitish Kumar, he went for a flood inspection last year. I was visiting Patna at that time. And he goes on his helicopter and he has a survey of Bihar from the helicopter. And he comes back and he says, he went looking for the flood, and he comes back and he says, Sukha zyada serious hai. The drought is more serious. Now, what he forgot to say, or perhaps didn't understand the issue well enough to say, is that both the flood and the drought have the same cause, which is climate change, right? So the glacial melt is causing the flood, and the lack of monsoon is causing the drought. Now, that's a very simple way in which I think one can understand that so-called global climate change is all too regional, all too local in our parts of the world. There was a time till not so long ago when our ministers of environment had to be convinced repeatedly, had to be told repeatedly that this is a problem, that you think it's a global issue, it's a very local issue. Now I think they've begun to understand that because agricultural yields are being affected and so on. Right now, in fact, with the unseasonal rain going on in North India, crops are destroyed in so many places. In Madhya Pradesh, you had 10,000 villages at least suffering from, unseasonal rain, and the crops are destroyed. We need to think of an approach which is multi-pronged and, in some deeper ethical sense, unilateral. The traditional approaches of hiding behind the poor and then going to international negotiations with negotiators from Western countries, noticing very clearly that our moral high ground is not nearly as high as we pretend. And nobody is an idiot when it comes to these things. These are the first things they get to learn about us. Is not going to work. This is one fundamental reason I claim why these negotiations have repeatedly broken down, because countries like India and China have presented their most hypocritical foot forward. When the relative footprints within our countries are so unjust, you can't go to international negotiations and expect the white man to behave. Why should he? He's been treating you much worse over the last several centuries. He's not going to listen to that kind of rubbish. So you need to adopt at least I'm saying, a Gandhian perspective, which is to look for unilateral ethical stances. And sustainability is an easy word, but when you start probing it, you realize the problems with it. You need very, very creative, very, very innovative new models of energy, of production, of transport, etc. For all those things, actually, India has the brain power. India has already developed systems and research models which can actually produce. Part of what I'm trying to do with this UP experiment in Delhi is trying to tell them, look, you don't have to do anything new. You simply have to take from what has already been done and put it out there and say that this is India's great contribution to the modern world's problems. So rather than thinking of ourselves as a future superpower, think of ourselves as an ecological pioneer for the world. And that's our best route to global power at this point of time. So one of the things which I'd like to just put out before everybody is the possibility of actually proposing a BRICS level negotiation, since this is about emerging economies. At the level of BRICS, I think one could think in terms of discussions which would actually prompt the leadership of these 5 or 6 influential nations to take ethically unilateral stances. Because I think some of this thing is so syndicated that, and given the edges at which competition is operating today, which is India, China are two of the critical players in the world, Brazil is another, that I think that if you can convince this smaller number of people outside the Western hemisphere, so to speak, Brazil, I'm including in the South, then I think there will be a major battle won. And that is the best way of publicly, openly, globally shaming a civilization which has very little shame left at this point. I think that that would be something worth thinking about and putting in the public discussions wherever we are. And there's a lot more, of course, which needs to be done. But I think I've exceeded well past my time.
Thank you so much.
No, it's open.
Yeah, the floor is open for your comments, suggestions, remarks. Nirma, can you please facilitate if there are any questions?
Well, thank you both for very enlightening. All right, can everyone hear me okay? This was very enlightening. I really appreciate your sharing these ideas with us. I have a number of questions, but I will restrict myself to one for the moment. And it's hard to choose which one, but I just want to get your perspective on geoengineering, because one of the really problematic issues that has arisen recently is, firstly, even the Western countries and various people are recognizing that we are not going to reach, we are not going to stay below 2 degrees C, and that even by 2050 we want to be above it, given the current trends. And we are told that infrastructure, for instance, takes about 50 to 70 years to change, changing infrastructure and so on. So it's almost as though we are being prepared to be frightened half to death, and then told, hey, we can save the world through geoengineering. It's interesting to note also that the massive R&D in geoengineering is being done by the oil industry. So I'm just wondering if you have comments on that situation. There's another question.
Question is for Pablo. I want to know that, as you said, that the new agreement which is going to come next year in Paris is going to be a little more lenient than what the Kyoto had to offer. So can we expect India and China to go in for commitments rather than pledges? And if not, then why not, when they are today contributing, or they have a major contribution to GHG gases? India, China, Mexico and South Africa together, when they contribute 58% of the global GHG emission today.
Continuing with Pablo, we had a talk. We had a talk in the office on BRICS, and he just mentioned it towards the end. Okay, I consider China, India, and Russia right now. With China, let's consider the case of Beijing, the world's most polluted city. India is just going headlong with the coal projects, and Russia is politically extremely unstable at the moment. So do you think we should have a lot of investiture in BRICS nations as such to have a certain agenda devised for us for the next COP, or which you said like probably BRICS would take up the onus of getting in our agenda in Paris in 2050? That's one thing. And other thing is, I'm slightly confused here between two terms that we used, because we started off by using that we should have ambitions to begin with and continue with the ambitions from 2014 onwards to 2020, that is 2018. Then you used the word pledges, and conventions is the third thing that was used, and we all will have to inevitably go with some conventions or protocols. I'm not really sure if I've understood the word ambition quite clearly here, because for me ambition could also mean a highly subjective phenomenon. So how would you actually spell this out?
My question is to both Pablo and Ashish. So recently, US has been, basically really singing the climate change song in the sense that, especially the Secretary of State, John Kerry, has been calling out to the politicians that you should now be more sensitive to climate change, be more proactive in these issues, and recently had a meeting with China also, and they issued a joint statement. In what light do you see U.S. moves? That's my question. Any other
Yeah,
questions?
maybe we can have first round.
Yeah, then
Yeah.
the second
Yeah,
round.
then-
Yes.
Well, all the questions are very, very important and interesting. I have 5. I wanted to address one issue to clarify. I think that the capitalist system has triggered this not only climate crisis, but systemic crisis. But now, in order to solve that, it's not enough to address the economic side of the society. So I agree fully with you, and I think that it's not only about addressing the issue of capital and getting beyond capital. We have to address the ways of living, the issues of gender, the issues of caste, of cultural discrimination. I mean, I think that an alternative society has to address all of this, and we cannot reduce only to the economic dimension. But of course, if we are not able to overcome the logic of capital, I don't see how we're going to solve, because the logic of capital is the logic to have more profit. I said it's like a vampire. To live, he needs more blood, and more blood. It's the only thing that cannot seek equilibrium. For capital, that word, it doesn't exist. It needs, capital will not exist. Capital needs more blood from humans, from nature, and so on. So, but it's not true that if we overcome the logic of capital, we're going to solve automatically all the other issues. No, I fully agree that it's not so. And that if we are speaking about systemic alternatives, and not only one, but many, we have to take into account the other dimensions that are not only the economic dimensions. Going to geoengineering, I think it's one of the biggest threats. So we're in a situation where it's like you said, they have put everything in a way that, hey, it's going to be impossible. So the only solution is through certain technologies. Geoengineering one, but they are also discussing about, hey, let's have trees, GMO trees that capture more CO2. Let's discuss about synthetic biology to send to the atmosphere certain molecules that will begin to eat in the atmosphere the CO2. Well, geoengineering, let's spread into the atmosphere other kind of gases that can limit the rays of the sun. Now, we are against geoengineering because we only have one planet, and in order to experiment with geoengineering, we have to experiment at a scale that the scale is the Earth. And whatever you do, if you fail, and in an experiment, in order to achieve something, you have to have several trials. You can worsen the thing, and you can disrupt even more the Earth system. Having said this, I am very worried because the last report of the IPCC, if you read the first part of the 5th report, it ends saying that, yeah, all of this is going to happen, the peaking year is this, and we're going to lose the path, but it all depends. They don't use the word geoengineering, but they use it it depends on how carbon capture and storage is going to move ahead. So they are opening the door to this idea that, hey, we can use fossil fuels forever. The only thing is if we find a technology that, in a way, reduces or the amount of CO2 of the fossil fuels before we use them, we burn them in our daily consumption, and we put that back into the earth. That is something that is already being tried. So I think that we have now to advocate not only for deep emission cuts and change in the patterns of way of life and so on, but we also have to advocate against this false technological solution and the false market solutions that are being promoted. We have not only the carbon markets, red, the carbon markets on forests, carbon markets on oceans and wildlife, blue ocean. Now they came with a new proposal that is climate smart agriculture. So in 2020, something that I didn't say to you, my guess is that the new convention will open to many new markets. Not only what we have now with the clean development mechanism, but we will probably have carbon markets on all these different sectors. In that sense, it will be even worse. If you want, we can discuss more about the issue of why the failure or why I am so in a position of carbon markets, and to create that we are going to preserve the cycles of nature through market. It's not only an illusion, it's exactly the contrary. Because market moves according to the demand, not according to what is needed in order to preserve those vital cycles. It will just disrupt them even more. Now, the other question, the new agreement, and what are the positions of India, China? Can they have commitments? My opinion, and I have write it down, because when I was a negotiator inside the UN, I had the traditional position. What is the traditional position? Is Annex 1 countries are the only ones that have commitment. And developing countries, because they didn't cause the problem, they just do voluntary actions. They don't have commitment. But I have realized that we all have to have commitments. Developed and developing countries. The difference is that commitments for developed countries have to be higher, much higher. Commitments for developing countries can be lower, can be in time further away, but there has to be commitment. I don't agree with the position of China, India, Brazil, that are the mainly defenders of the idea that, hey, we don't have to have any kind of tie. We don't have any kind of commitment. We only have to have pledges. I have had discussions with some negotiators of India. For example, India could take the lead and say, okay, we think that the target for emissions should be to think of a level of emissions for 2025 to limit to 5,000 tons of CO2 per person And for India, that gives them a lot of space. But it forces others to reduce. But the issue that India doesn't put any number on the table, and even China doesn't put any table, because India has, it's so low that India can put a number on the table and force everybody to take that number. So if India would come with a proposal that says, instead of saying, oh, I don't want to have any kind of commitment because I didn't cause it, which is true. But if they come saying, okay, it's going to be 5,000 or 4,000 or 6,000, and I'm India, I'm the one that is suffering more and I didn't cause it, and now all of you have to agree on that. India has a very, I would say in the negotiation, has a very moral voice. And everybody recognizes it, because of course you're speaking about 1.3 billion, and everybody's clear that this problem was not caused by India. So definitely I think that India could play that role, but that's not the way I have seen from the side of India. India is more in a position of no commitment, and what we're going to do is a pledge, and no reference for everybody. In the case of China, it's the same, and China, I think, is going to promote something that is a new kind of target. It's not a target in absolute terms, but in relative terms. So instead of saying, okay, instead of having emissions of 58, we have to reduce to 44. That is what we would say a commitment in absolute terms. I'm saying I'm going to reduce from 55 to 44. But China, and also Brazil, is saying, hey, let's do pledges, but that say that per unit of GDP that I grow, I will not increase 1, but I will increase only 0.8. So it doesn't mean that you're going to reduce emissions, but you're going to increase less according to your growth. At the end of the day, for the Earth system, you're going to increase greenhouse gas emissions. And there is the danger that the new agreement that is going to be enforced by 2020, when it's going to be too late, will be focused not on an absolute target, but on relative targets, like what we are seeing in the pledges that China and Brazil have put on the table, and also India. Now, and the question on the ambition, it's a word that is used in the climate negotiations. The word ambition means everybody recognizes that the pledges that are already on the table are too small. So they use the word raise the ambition, so make those pledges higher. So they are having now a negotiation in Bonn to make those pledges higher. And to that, they use the word raise the ambition. So in that sense, I use it. When we hear the word ambition in the climate change negotiations, it means increase your pledge. So instead of saying that you're going to have reductions of 20%, say you're going to reduce 25% or 30%. And that has to do mainly with from here until 2020, because there are not yet pledges for 2020 and beyond. Now, the BRICS countries are the ones that, because you have now LDC, least development countries, that have said, we want commitment. And we are willing to make commitment. Because we as countries are going to disappear. Some of them are small island states and are going to disappear. So let's have commitment. So the ones that are in a position of commitments from developing countries are the BRICS countries. I think the BRIC countries should have commitments, but commitments taking into account their common but differentiated responsibility. So lower than what Annex 1 parties have to do, but they have to. China is the first emitter in the world now, and he will become, by 2025, not only the first emitter in the world, but the first emitter in historical terms, because every year the emissions of China are increasing.
By which year?
By 2025. It depends if they continue like this, but they are going to become, to be as historical emitters as the US. Now they are, in historical terms, 9%, 9 to 10%. So, it's not possible to say you are not going to have a commitment. And even more, when you go to China, not only because of Beijing, everybody knows what happens there, but I have seen they build cities, dozens of buildings that are empty. Nobody goes to live there. They build them because that makes the economy move. But that logic is going to burn us, because, of course, if in order to have movement and to have indicators of growth, we're going to do that with the amount of consumption of cement and everything. Wow. So definitely I think that there has to be commitments and targets also for the BRICS countries. Now, the possibility to convince the BRICS countries, I find it very, very difficult. In reality, what happened in Cancun was an agreement between China and the US. Because Europe accepts to have commitment, accepts to have targets. The two that don't want to have targets and commitments are the US and China. So in Cancun, they managed to have an agreement that was based on voluntary pledges, and that was mainly not because Europe was pushing for that, that was because China and the US agreed to say, or it's that, or it's nothing. So it's a very, very difficult situation. And the other thing that we have seen is that the majority of the governments have been captured by big corporations that have a lot of interest when it comes to oil, when it comes to coal. So in reality, you can convince maybe even the minister, the chief negotiator, but the corporations that are behind the government, they are the ones that have the real power. So, and it's them who are going to put a lot of pressure to the government, even if the minister says, I agree, this should not be the case. This is bad for you, man. But the others, hey, we have a loan with you, we have this project, we're willing to reconsider this if you have that strong position. So this is an issue. So I think that we cannot only try to advocate government if we at the same time don't deal with the corporations that have captured many of the government, and especially the BRICS government. Finally, what is the US? Where is the US moving? The US is the winner of the negotiations because they have managed to have an agreement now where they are not outside of the agreement. Because before they were the bad guys, they were outside of the Kyoto Protocol, while all the other Annex 1 parties were inside. Now, the US is outside the Kyoto Protocol, Canada is outside the Kyoto Protocol, Japan is outside the Kyoto Protocol, Australia is outside the Kyoto Protocol. So Europe, mainly it's Europe, Norway, Switzerland. So in reality, they have succeeded in order to empty. And this Kyoto Protocol now has a provision for this period that says that if you want to reduce your pledge, you can. So in reality, that means that whatever you say you're going to do, 2 years, 3 years later, you can say, oh, I'm going to do less. So in reality, it's even worse than the previous Kyoto Protocol. And the commitment of the US is a shame. I mean, there is no doubt that the main responsible of climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, is the US. Historical emissions, 27%, 28%. So if we account the amount of new CO2 particles in a year, 28 out of 100 are made in the US. It's the biggest historical emitter. But the US has put a pledge on the table that says that they are going to reduce only 3% of their greenhouse gas emissions, taking into account the level of 1990. So even less than the first period of the Kyoto Protocol. So why the level of ambition for this period is so low of pledges is because other countries say, oh, if the US, the main responsible, is going to do so little, why am I going to do more? Which in a way you can say it's very understandable. The US is going to do 3%. In a way you can say that China is doing more than the US, and you can demonstrate it. And the Chinese, of course, if you put the reference is going to be what the US has put on the table, but the reference has to be what we need in order to preserve the Earth system, and that is the complication. So the US is key, and I don't see any possibility that the US will increase its current pledge. From 3%, they will not increase it. So that is why I don't think we're going to see bigger, higher pledges for the period from here to 2020. And the US wants a voluntary agreement beyond 2020. What the US wants is that China and India and Brazil are part of the agreement. So the US doesn't want to have an agreement only for Annex 1 parties. They want to have an agreement for everybody. But they want that everybody does only pledges, voluntary pledges. No commitment. And I think we're moving in that direction.
I think Pablo has answered all the questions. I just want to say one thing in response to the geoengineering question. I think that something we have to be on the lookout for all the time these days is where the market opportunities are in the green arena, and how that has justification in terms of growth of GDP. And there I think what one needs to argue and strengthen the arguments for is how the GDP is being systematically mismeasured. And I'll just give you one simple example. Last July, the World Bank itself came out with a report which showed that even if you just take account of a few key losses like forests and a few others, in India, the GDP growth rate over the last 10 years or so has to be knocked down by some 40 to 50%, the growth rate. So if you actually measure GDP growth accurately in terms of correcting for public bads and pollution and climate change and so on, you might actually be hitting into negative numbers. And so what one needs to do is two things: strengthen the green accounting of the state. And there are some moves afoot in that direction with the Partha Dasgupta committee and so on. and the other is to actually build the arguments for alternatives based on that.
Another round of questions, yeah. Mike.
You said systemic crisis. I think if there is a lot of crisis of faith in the society, and with this crisis of faith, neither we have a faith on the institutions, nor we have faith on government. So the coming alternatives, even we are not able to identify which is going to work and which is not going to work. And other things we may restore in that due course of time. How to restore this crisis of faith? I don't know whether if you ask someone, people say this is a question of spirituality, somebody says this is a question of social science, somebody says this is a question of behavior. But when we talk of the whole crisis issue of the climate, the economy, even these issues from where the alternate has to come, they are being directed by the market. So that's why you have too many channels, last article, everything, and you don't find the real answer. So I mean, common man is at loss what to do and where to follow. To whom to believe, whether to our government or to the World Bank. You know, recently this report, human rights in man. You know, I lost faith because I don't believe on the data which is coming out here. That is what this crisis of faith is coming out.
Yeah, my name is Nagaraj, and thanks Pablo and Aseem for giving presentations and discussion. I've got 3 or 4 somewhat disconnected and disjointed points. One is, I think we also need to look at a little more about pressure from below within the country in terms of pressurizing governments to actually take different stances to move forward. And then if we look at the specific countries where current emissions are rising, because if you are assuming and saying quite rightly that the situation is very urgent, we need to sort of cut now, then let's look at the areas where emissions are actually rising. And look at the most recent data, those countries are, I think, roughly in order of rise. It's China, India, Russia, Iran, Mexico, one more, I forget which. The countries that are stagnating are Japan, the EU, and the US. US is in fact declining side. Now, then let's look at these countries and understand 2 things. One is that why is it that these countries are rising? And I suspect in some but not all, there's very rapid industrialization happening. Very rapid urbanization happening. And that's certainly the case for China and India. I'm not sure the others, actually. Aseem, you might know better. That's one. The second aspect is pressure from below. And how are we going to push governments to actually act and move forward? Now in India, as all of us know, there are a range of extremely vibrant ecological and other movements, but they are linked to climate, but I don't think that the mass base in those areas are being motivated because of climate change. And people are opposing coal projects because they don't want to get displaced, or because of local health issues, or because of local pollution, or their water, or their agriculture, but not because climate change is an issue. Yeah? Which is no reason to support them completely as we do, but it's not climate that's driving them. I think in each of these countries, but certainly in China and India, the movement is actually extremely weak, if not absolute, at the moment. I mean, in fact, somebody from CPR made the point that in China it's actually local pollution that you can see rather than climate change is driving agitating people. So that's one point we need to talk about. The second part, which I think is a dynamic that's unfolding, is a dynamic of capitalism in India, but not just in urban areas, also capitalism in Indian agriculture. When the old debate about the mode of production debate in the 70s, to me, I think the debate is a settled debate. It's over. And capitalism is unfolding in Indian agriculture at a rate that is just staggering. But why is it that suicides are happening now and not, say, 35 years ago? Because of a logic of capitalism. In that case, I completely agree with Pablo. It has a logic. And in that sense, I think you don't mind my saying something that we've talked in private. I'm not sure that competitive industrialism actually captures that logic. For instance, I don't think it's possible for Russia and China to happen, the economies to happen, let's say, in the 16th century, without an advent of a certain capitalism elsewhere. Yeah, I think there's that logic which I think is central to global warming. That's how we need to think about it. And one problem which I may have raised with Pablo in the previous presentation he made is where is the economic alternative to capitalism on the scale necessary? This is something that some of you have heard me say in the last 4 or 5 meetings. You're probably bored of my saying it. But I would love to hear about what's happening in Latin America, which Pablo knows intimately. And Bolivia, of course, but also besides Bolivia. Because to me, there seem to be political alternatives and they're extremely crucial, and I want to support many or most of them. But I wonder how much, to what extent they are economic alternatives on the scale necessary. And by economic alternatives, I mean exactly what Pablo said. How much are they an alternative to the logic of capitalism? Okay? Now just two more disjointed points and I'll stop. I think we also need to think about energy choices. Much as we're talking about capitalism and social and political change, I think somewhere from my engagements in the last few months and years, I just noticed the fact that people are shying away from talking about what might be a most safe energy choice. And I've said this often again, if you're opposing coal, you're opposing large hydro, if you're opposing nuclear, then I think you need to think about where is energy going to come from. To me, at a very simplistic level, I think it's going to come from solar. And we can talk about details, I don't want to get into detail, but I think we need to talk about that. And in that, I think we need to accept that much as we oppose capitalism, for the moment if climate change is an urgent problem, then capital has a role in expanding solar. You cannot expand solar on the scale necessary, or in fact you cannot expand any alternative energy source on the scale necessary without capital having some role, without industry some role in that. There's a very complex grid system unfolding in India at the moment where capital is an increasing role. We can't just run away from it. Finally, there's something which I think doesn't get enough attention in talks about global and meetings about discussions on global warming is what we are doing to other species. And how are we going to think about other species and not focus on ourselves alone? Like I think Pablo said in a Copernican or a pre-Copernican fashion. One of course would be simply the extinctions that are talked about in species. But again, let's bear in mind that far more extinctions happen for other reasons than have happened in the last 40 years or more than climate change. IUCN says out of 864 known extinctions, I think 20 have happened because of climate change. And even that we do. But I suspect that climate change is going to be even more of a factor as we go along. And more species are going to become extinct, specifically because of different aspects of climate change. There's a lot of probably local information, like Ajay would know what's happening in Uttarakhand, people know in different areas. But that itself needs to be corrected. How are we impacting species? One aspect in terms of argument would be, and people often say, what would damage of species do to us? How do humans get impacted if species get impacted? That is a good tactical argument, but I think that's not a shift in our frame of looking at the thing. We cannot again put ourselves in the center. What are we doing to species, What are we doing with them? We are only one upon among 1.7 million known species, probably more.